I was just her client, until she whispered, "Your appointment isn't over, the fun part's next." The moment I walked into her office, something about the air seemed different, though I couldn't put my finger on it. I had been to countless appointments before, but this time, I felt an unspoken tension, a quiet pull that made me straighten my posture and try to appear calm. She was behind her desk, reviewing notes, yet somehow the mundane paperwork felt charged with meaning. She looked up as I entered, and her eyes caught mine, sharp, warm, and subtly assessing. The kind of gaze that made you aware of every small movement, every subtle detail of yourself, as if she could see the parts you didn't even realize existed. She smiled, and it was effortless, confident, yet touched with a softness that drew you in. It wasn't flirtation in a cartoonish sense, not overt or demanding. It was quiet, magnetic, the kind of smile that made ordinary gestures feel intimate. Her hands moved gracefully over the papers, and when she leaned forward to explain something, the edge of her sleeve brushed lightly against my wrist. That simple touch, so fleeting, sent a small jolt through me, and I realized I had been holding my breath. There was an elegance in her movements that made her presence feel like a slow, deliberate dance. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, not overpowering, but subtle, floral, grounding, and it seemed to wrap around me without permission. I caught myself studying the way sunlight fell across her hair, highlighting strands of soft brown and gold. Each tiny detail seemed amplified, and I couldn't help but feel like the world had narrowed to this single room, this single moment. She spoke, her voice low and measured, explaining the next steps of my appointment. But there was a rhythm in her words, a cadence that made me lean in, unconsciously absorbing everything she said. I realized I was listening not just to the instructions, but to her tone, the small inflections, the pause before she smiled at something she clearly found amusing. The ordinary words of a professional consultation suddenly carried a subtle weight, a hint of something more behind them. I tried to focus on the task at hand, reminding myself that she was the professional, and I was the client. Yet, the boundary felt porous. There was a quiet energy between us, the kind that isn't forced or artificial, but builds slowly, with a sense of inevitability. Every gesture, every glance, seemed layered with meaning, though nothing was overt. When she handed me a document, our fingers brushed for a second longer than necessary, and I felt a warmth spreading through me, an awareness that this interaction was no longer purely procedural. By the time the appointment seemed to be drawing to a close, I realized I had been caught off guard, not by her beauty, though that was undeniable, but by the way she commanded attention without demanding it, by the subtle invitation in her eyes, by the quiet steadiness of her presence. I left the office that day feeling unusually aware of my own thoughts, of the flutter in my chest, and of the undeniable sense that this was only the beginning. Something about her, something unspoken, had already begun to pull me in. After that first appointment, I found myself thinking about her far more than I expected. It wasn't just her elegance or her beauty, though those were undeniable, but the way she seemed to notice things I didn't even realize about myself. The following week, when I returned, the air felt charged, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for us both to step back inside. The office was quiet, the soft hum of a distant fan filling the pauses in conversation, but the energy between us made it feel warmer, more intimate than it should have been. She greeted me with that same calm, confident smile, yet there was something new in it, a hint of amusement, a subtle teasing undercurrent that made my chest tighten. "Back so soon?" she asked lightly, tilting her head as if she knew exactly what I was thinking. It was a simple question, professional on the surface, yet laced with unspoken curiosity. I found myself smiling before I could stop it, aware that my heartbeat had just betrayed me. During the appointment, she continued with her usual explanations, but her gestures seemed more intentional this time. When she leaned across the desk to point something out, her hand brushed mine again. Not by accident, it seemed, though it could have been. A warmth traveled up my arm, subtle but undeniable, leaving a lingering awareness long after her hand had moved away. Each time she spoke, I caught the small glances she threw in my direction, the way her eyes lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. Her laughter became a dangerous thing, too. A soft, genuine sound that pulled me in without warning. When I made a clumsy joke or fumbled a detail, she tilted her head and let that quiet laugh ripple through the room. There was no ridicule, only an understanding that made me feel seen, noticed, and somehow appreciated. I found myself listening not just for the information she was providing, but for the subtle layers beneath, the unspoken warmth, the gentle teasing, the brief moments of connection that hovered in the air like sunlight through a window. There was a tension I couldn't ignore, not loud or dramatic, but persistent, growing steadily like the slow thrum of a heartbeat. Every time her fingers brushed against mine, every glance that held a little too long, made me aware of the space between us, close enough to feel it, yet distant enough to wonder if it was appropriate. I questioned myself constantly, trying to separate professional decorum from the stirrings of curiosity and desire that were beginning to take hold. And yet, I felt drawn to her in a way that defied logic. It wasn't just attraction, it was a recognition of depth, a sense that behind her poised exterior was someone quietly complex, someone who could understand and challenge me in ways I hadn't anticipated. That pull, subtle and insistent, made me linger in moments that should have been fleeting, made me savor the slight warmth of proximity, the soft cadence of her voice, the unspoken acknowledgement in her eyes that perhaps she felt it too. By the time the appointment ended, I realized something important. I wasn't just here for the appointment anymore. I was here because of her, because of the quiet tension that crackled in the air and made ordinary moments feel electric. The slow burn of something far more personal had begun, and neither of us could fully ignore it, not without betraying the subtle yet undeniable connection that was steadily growing between us. A week later, when I returned, there was a different energy in the office. The initial spark of curiosity and subtle flirtation had settled into something quieter, more intimate. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, it was the kind of slow shift that catches you unawares, like sunlight gradually spilling across a room. She greeted me with her usual calm confidence, but her eyes held a warmth I hadn't noticed before, a kind of invitation that made me immediately aware of how close I wanted to be, not physically, not in a rushed way, but in the sense of truly seeing her. The appointment started as usual, but somewhere in the middle, the conversation drifted. She shared a small, personal story, something entirely unrelated to work, a fleeting memory, tinged with a mix of humor and wistfulness. I listened, genuinely intrigued, and for the first time, I noticed the softness in her voice, the subtle hesitation before she smiled, as if letting me in a little further than usual. It was a vulnerable moment, delicate and unguarded, and I realized that the spark of attraction had begun to intertwine with something deeper, trust and emotional connection. I found myself leaning forward without thinking, absorbing every word, the tone of her voice, the slight curve of her lips when she laughed softly at her own memory. Her hands rested lightly on the desk, and when she shifted closer to show me something, the edge of her sleeve brushed my forearm. The touch was fleeting, almost accidental, yet it left a warmth that lingered far longer than the moment itself. It wasn't meant to be provocative, it was natural, graceful, but in the quiet intimacy of the office, it felt charged. We found ourselves talking more openly, pauses stretching comfortably between sentences. I noticed her fingers drumming lightly against the edge of the desk, a small rhythm that seemed to mirror my own subtle awareness of proximity. Her eyes met mine frequently, and in those glances, there was an unspoken acknowledgement, that we were both aware of the shift in our dynamic, that the professional boundaries we had tried to maintain were softening in the most natural, human way. There was a moment when we both laughed at something trivial, and we didn't immediately look away. Instead, we held the shared laughter for a beat longer, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection forming between us. I became acutely aware of her presence, the faint scent of her perfume, the warmth of her shoulder close to mine as she reached across the desk, the subtle cadence of her breathing as she paused thoughtfully. All these small details wove together, creating a delicate tension, a gentle intimacy that neither of us had expected, yet neither of us tried to deny. By the time the appointment was concluding, I felt a sense of quiet revelation. It wasn't just attraction anymore, it was emotional resonance. I realized I was drawn not only to her beauty or confidence, but to her complexity, her ability to reveal pieces of herself gradually, and the way she made me feel both seen and understood. The subtle touch of her hand, the shared glances, the warmth of her presence, it was all building towards something more profound, something that could no longer be contained by polite professionalism. As I left that day, I carried with me the lingering warmth of her vulnerability, and a sense that the slow, steady pull between us had shifted into something more significant. The connection was no longer a fleeting curiosity, it had become a delicate, unspoken bond that promised depth, tenderness, and the kind of intimacy that grows slowly, deliberately, and memorably. The next appointment arrived with an unspoken weight. I could feel it even before I entered her office. The quiet energy that had been building between us now hovered, like a charged current just below the surface. She greeted me as usual, but there was a spark in her eyes that made me pause in the doorway, heart suddenly aware of how fast it was beating. It wasn't a smile of flirtation exactly, but something subtler, more layered, playful, confident, and somehow daring. As the session began, our conversation flowed as naturally as before, but there was a new tension I couldn't ignore. She leaned over to show me a detail in the document, and her hand brushed mine again, lingering just a heartbeat longer than strictly necessary. I felt the warmth travel up my arm, a tiny jolt that made me acutely conscious of the space between us. Every glance she threw my way, every soft inflection in her voice, seemed charged with meaning. It was almost imperceptible, yet impossible to miss. At some point, she made a teasing remark about my attention to detail, her lips curving with that effortless confidence. I found myself laughing, but my laughter felt different this time, aware, charged with something that neither of us had fully admitted. The tension was subtle, layered, like a conversation that had as much weight in its silences as in its words. I felt simultaneously drawn to her and cautious, aware that the age difference and professional context should create boundaries I was increasingly tempted to ignore. Her gestures became more deliberate, though never overt. A brief touch to guide me toward a paper, a gentle shift in posture that closed the distance slightly, a glance that lingered in ways that made me swallow hard. Each small action carried a meaning I couldn't put into words, a silent invitation that teased without demanding. The slow burn between us was now undeniable, an almost tangible force in the room that made every ordinary motion feel electric. Internally, I wrestled with the contradiction of desire and propriety. The pull I felt toward her was intoxicating, but I reminded myself of the professional context, the social expectations, the age difference that loomed quietly in my mind. And yet, she seemed aware of it too, the way she leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine, a subtle smirk playing at her lips. There was a challenge in her movements, a test of boundaries that was playful yet deeply intimate. We reached a moment of quiet in the middle of our session. I could feel her presence close, her attention focused entirely on me. The soft brush of her hand as she reached for a pen, the slight warmth of her arm when she adjusted her position, every small gesture spoke louder than words could. I caught myself imagining what it would be like if the boundaries weren't there, if we allowed ourselves to lean into the tension that was building between us. By the time the appointment ended, I left the office with my mind buzzing and my heart caught somewhere between anticipation and hesitation. The connection was no longer a subtle spark, it had become a slow-burning flame, quietly daring me to acknowledge it, to test it, to explore what might lie beyond the professional space we inhabited. And though we hadn't crossed any lines yet, both of us knew that something was shifting irreversibly, a pull neither of us could ignore. The next meeting carried with it a quiet sense of inevitability. I walked into her office and immediately felt the subtle charge in the air that had been building over the past appointments. She looked up from her notes, and her eyes met mine with that same effortless warmth, but there was something more this time, a spark of acknowledgement, as if she, too, could no longer ignore the pull between us. The professional barrier that had kept our interactions carefully measured seemed thinner, almost porous, though neither of us mentioned it aloud. We began as usual, discussing the matter at hand, but the conversation quickly drifted into more personal territory. She shared a small detail about her life, something intimate yet light-hearted, and for the first time, I realized how deeply I was listening, not just to her words, but to the nuances in her voice, the rhythm of her speech, the quiet vulnerability hidden beneath her confident exterior. I noticed the subtle way her fingers brushed against the papers, and the edge of her hand nearly touched mine when she leaned closer to point something out. The accidental intimacy of it made my chest tighten with awareness. At one point, she paused, and our eyes met for a long, deliberate beat. There was no need for words, the glance carried everything. I felt an almost dizzying mix of emotions, anticipation, curiosity, and a quiet longing I hadn't fully allowed myself to acknowledge before. The professional facade had begun to crack, revealing the raw tension that had been simmering beneath every polite smile and measured gesture. As we continued, she laughed softly at one of my observations, and I realized that her laughter had become intoxicating. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was gentle, authentic, and filled with warmth that reached beyond mere amusement. I caught myself leaning slightly closer, drawn in not only by the sound but by the unspoken connection it seemed to celebrate. Every pause, every fleeting touch, a brush of her fingers against mine while handing over a paper, the soft pressure of her arm near mine as she shifted, carried a charge that neither of us could ignore. It was in those quiet, unguarded moments that the emotional stakes shifted. I realized that what I felt for her was no longer simply admiration or curiosity. There was a deeper awareness, a recognition of desire, tempered by respect and a growing understanding of her complexity. I noticed the way she observed me, as if measuring my reactions, and it struck me that she was aware of the effect she had, aware of the tension she elicited. Yet, it was never manipulative, it was an invitation, subtle and precise, to acknowledge the pull without crossing the lines we both understood. By the end of the appointment, the atmosphere had changed. We shared a quiet moment, her hand resting lightly near mine on the desk, our shoulders almost touching, and a glance that lingered just long enough to speak volumes. There was an unspoken agreement in that silence, a mutual acknowledgement of the desire we had been building toward and the emotional intimacy that had quietly grown alongside it. As I left, I felt a rush of warmth and anticipation, mixed with the serene satisfaction of having crossed an emotional threshold without rushing, without forcing anything. The slow burn between us had deepened into something more tangible, more resonant. It was no longer just curiosity or tension, it was a conscious recognition of the pull we both felt, a subtle promise that the connection could grow into something truly profound, deliberate, and unforgettable. The next appointment felt different from the moment I stepped into the building. The quiet hum of the office, the sunlight streaming through the blinds, even the faint scent of her perfume seemed charged with anticipation. I could feel it the instant I saw her, the way her eyes met mine with a softness that had begun to replace the teasing glances of before. There was no need for overt words, the slow, steady pull between us had become palpable, and it was as if the room itself held its breath in quiet expectation. We started the session as usual, discussing the details that had brought me there, but it quickly became apparent that our professional interaction was no longer the center of attention. Our conversation flowed effortlessly, with pauses that allowed for shared glances and subtle smiles. She leaned closer across the desk to point something out, and her hand brushed mine once more. The warmth of her touch lingered longer than it had before, and I caught myself savoring the subtle intimacy without overthinking it. It was a delicate balance, a dance between restraint and quiet closeness. At one point, she laughed softly at something I said, a sound that wrapped around me like a familiar melody. I realized that the simple presence of her voice had become enough to make my heart race slightly, a reminder that attraction was no longer a fleeting curiosity but something deeper and more complex. Her eyes sparkled with an understanding that mirrored my own awareness, and in that moment, the emotional tension between us reached a gentle peak. She gestured for me to sit closer on the edge of the sofa in her lounge, ostensibly to review a few notes together. Our proximity was subtle but significant, the warmth of her shoulder near mine, the quiet brush of her hand against mine when she handed over a pen, the soft cadence of her voice drawing me in with each explanation. Every gesture felt charged with meaning, though it remained wholly appropriate, comfortable, and safe. In the silence between sentences, I felt an unspoken acknowledgement of the connection we had been cultivating, the slow burn that had finally begun to blossom into tenderness. As the session drew toward its natural close, she reached out and adjusted a strand of hair that had fallen across her face. Her fingers brushed lightly against my arm, and I felt a shiver of awareness, a quiet, electrifying intimacy that left me acutely conscious of her presence. I noticed the small rise and fall of her chest as she exhaled softly, and the gentle weight of her hand lingering near mine, creating a sense of closeness that neither of us had openly articulated but that we both understood. In that moment, I realized that the slow, careful progression of our connection had led to a rare and precious clarity. This was no longer just a playful tension or subtle flirtation, it was genuine emotional intimacy, rooted in mutual respect, understanding, and attraction. The warmth between us was palpable, yet tender, and it left me with a profound sense of fulfillment and anticipation. As I left the office that day, I felt the lingering touch of her presence, the memory of her gentle hand, her quiet smile, and the undeniable connection that had grown steadily between us. It was a slow burn that had finally reached an emotional climax, leaving both of us aware that what we shared was meaningful, deliberate, and entirely unforgettable. For the first time, I truly understood the depth of what had been quietly developing, a connection that promised tenderness, care, and a slow, deliberate journey towards something extraordinary. When I returned for our final appointment, there was a sense of quiet inevitability in the air. I could feel it the moment I stepped into her office, a soft anticipation that wasn't urgent or demanding, but calm and knowing, like two people who had been navigating a slow current finally reaching a gentle shore. She looked up from her notes, her eyes meeting mine with that familiar warmth, yet now it was deeper, steadier, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had been building between us. We began as usual, discussing the remaining details of my appointment, but the conversation felt lighter, more natural. The professional barrier that had once defined our interactions was no longer the center of attention. Instead, our focus had shifted to the quiet moments in between, shared glances, soft smiles, and the subtle awareness of each other's presence. Her hand brushed mine lightly as she passed a document, a touch so natural and deliberate that it felt like a small, unspoken promise. At one point, she paused mid-sentence and looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen before. "You've become someone I look forward to seeing," she said, almost in a whisper, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. It was simple, honest, and entirely without pretense. Her words carried the weight of our shared journey, the slow, deliberate steps we had taken to move beyond curiosity, beyond playful tension, and into genuine connection. I realized then that what I felt for her wasn't fleeting attraction. It was something deeper, a quiet certainty that had grown alongside the intimacy we had cultivated. We spent the next few minutes in a comfortable silence, our proximity close but unforced. Her shoulder brushed mine as she leaned slightly to retrieve a pen, the subtle warmth of her presence grounding me. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, familiar and comforting, wrapping around the small space we shared. Her eyes met mine often, and in each glance, there was a mutual understanding, a recognition of the connection we had nurtured and a quiet promise that it could continue to grow. As the appointment drew to a close, she stood and gestured toward the door. I followed, and before we parted, she reached out, her fingers lightly brushing the back of my hand. I felt the steady warmth of her touch, and instinctively, I held it for a moment longer. There was no rush, no urgency, just the quiet affirmation that what we had found in each other was real, deliberate, and meaningful. We shared a gentle hug, her head resting briefly against my shoulder, and in that simple embrace, I felt the culmination of everything we had built: trust, admiration, subtle desire, and deep emotional intimacy. It was a moment of closure, yet also a beginning, a slow-burn connection that had reached fulfillment without haste, and with every nuance carefully cherished. As I stepped out of her office, the memory of her warmth lingered. I realized that the slow, patient journey we had taken was what made this connection extraordinary. It wasn't a fleeting spark or impulsive passion, it was something rare, tender, and enduring, a bond built on mutual respect, shared moments, and the quiet thrill of emotional closeness. I left with a serene sense of anticipation for what lay ahead, knowing that our story had reached its satisfying, heartfelt conclusion, but also that this was just the beginning of something truly extraordinary between us. If this slow-burn connection between them kept your heart racing, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more age gap romance stories. Comment below which moment made your heart skip a beat.